Leo Harrison never considered himself the kind of man who made enemies, but he had always understood that peace in a neighborhood was more about quiet endurance than mutual understanding. He didn't throw barbecues or wave at every passing car, but he showed respect in the way he maintained his property, paid his taxes, and left people alone. His house sat at the end of a short cul-de-sac, a 1970s single-story build his father had paid off before Leo was even born. It wasn't impressive by modern standards. No smart home automation, no solar panels, no luxury facade, but it was sturdy, and more importantly, it was his. It had been his father's, and now it was his. The concrete driveway that curved gently from the street to his garage had never needed anything more than occasional sealing, and the gate at the front had been replaced 3 times over the years, each time with something a little more secure. A little more efficient, never extravagant. Leo had a good relationship with function and didn't feel the need to dress it up. The neighborhood had changed over time. What used to be a collection of modest homes had evolved into a semi-gated community by default, not by design. As the years passed, new families moved in, tech professionals, retirees with city money, and the kind of people who brought in contractors for minor yard work and complained about the color of mailbox flags. They joined the neighborhood council with gusto, created newsletters no one asked for, and slowly began to morph the once-loose collection of private homes into something vaguely managed. Leo had watched it happen the way you watch a distant thunderstorm. Aware, a little uneasy, but not immediately concerned. He didn't attend meetings. He didn't vote on shared expenditures. And, for the most part, people left him alone. His house wasn't part of the development circle, technically. It was adjacent, tucked just past where the paved road dipped down and narrowed, and while it appeared to be inside the informal boundary of the neighborhood, it wasn't on any of their association paperwork. Which is why, when Leo woke up on a cool spring morning to the sound of drilling and diesel engines just outside his property line, he didn't panic. At first, he assumed someone was repairing a leak or rerouting utilities. He pulled on his jacket, stepped out onto the porch, and squinted against the brightening sun. What he saw instead was a concrete saw slicing through the asphalt at the end of his driveway. 2 workmen in reflective vests were already positioning a metal post on one side of the cut. Another man, clearly in charge, stood to the side holding a clipboard and barking instructions. Beyond them, parked just off the main road, was a flatbed truck carrying what looked unmistakably like a mechanized gate. Leo descended the steps slowly, each movement deliberate, already feeling the pulse rise in his temples. "Excuse me," he called, his voice low but sharp, cutting across the churn of machinery. One of the workers paused, turned slightly, and waved toward the man with the clipboard. He turned to Leo with the kind of expression bureaucrats mastered, a blend of forced politeness and latent irritation. "Morning," the man said flatly. "You the owner here?" "I am," Leo answered, "and I didn't authorize any work on this property." "You're not on the authorized access list," the man replied, consulting his clipboard. "But this isn't your property. This area is scheduled for infrastructure improvements under Community Regulation Expansion Phase 2. Everything's been approved." Leo didn't need a lawyer to know that was bullshit. The curb they were tearing up wasn't public. His father had paved it back in 1982, and Leo had kept the records, receipts, permits, even the municipal letters confirming it fell outside city maintenance. His driveway connected directly to it. He'd paid to reseal that road 4 years ago, and not once had anyone else contributed. Now they were cutting into it without notice, without even the basic courtesy of a conversation. "I want the name of whoever approved this," Leo said, "and I want work stopped immediately until it's clarified." The man hesitated. There was a flicker of discomfort, quickly masked. "You can contact the council office. It's all public record. But this is happening today, sir." Leo stared at the man, then passed him to the machinery, the posts, the cables coiled in thick bundles waiting to be laid underground. This wasn't a small install. This was infrastructure, meant to last, meant to control. The implications thudded in his chest like a second heartbeat. They were building a gate at the end of his driveway, a digital, automated structure that would regulate entry and exit into the cul-de-sac. And somehow they had decided his home, was inside their perimeter. He returned inside, not out of retreat but to gather himself. He didn't scream. He didn't throw anything. Leo didn't operate on theatrics. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a thin folder, and flipped through the documents until he found the deed. Then the easement map. Then the paving invoices from the last repair. Within 20 minutes he was back outside, documents in hand. But the machinery had already moved forward. A shallow trench had been cut across the asphalt, and one of the metal posts now stood anchored, drying in concrete. They were past the point of asking for permission. Leo walked to the edge of the trench and stood in silence for a long minute, letting the tension build without words. The foreman, sensing movement, looked up again. "You're trespassing," Leo said, calmly but unmistakably serious. "You have 10 minutes to stop work and clear this property, or I'll have law enforcement involved, and I will press charges." The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. Something in Leo's tone made even the backup generator seem quieter. He glanced at his crew, gestured for a pause. They stepped back from the trench. "We'll call this in," the foreman said carefully. "But this is above my pay grade." Leo nodded once, then elevated. The work ceased for that day, but Leo knew it wasn't over. He made calls, first to the city's property office, then to the legal assistance clinic he occasionally consulted for contract review. What he learned was worse than he imagined. There had been a series of proposals passed at community meetings over the past year. Small changes, incremental, but together they created a framework that would allow the council to claim shared regulation over perimeter streets deemed common use, access. His property, long overlooked, was now considered a connective node in the community's design. And worse, a vote had been held 6 weeks earlier to authorize gate installation for safety and traffic control. His name wasn't on any recipient list for notices. He didn't vote. He wasn't invited. And now they were planning to regulate his front gate with a badge reader system he hadn't agreed to install. When he returned home that evening, he found an envelope taped to his mailbox. Inside was a formal letter with the neighborhood crest embossed at the top and polite language expressing appreciation for his understanding during ongoing infrastructure work. It ended with an offer to register your household as an authorized access point in the system, ensuring uninterrupted entry during the upgrade period. Leo stared at it for a long time. They were already assuming victory. He didn't sleep much that night. He sat at his kitchen table sipping cold coffee and reviewing documents, site maps, and legal boundaries by the dim light of a single lamp. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. But the stillness that settled over him was not peace. It was pressure concentrating into precision. Something had shifted, not just in the neighborhood, but in how people like Karen, people who smiled through control, believed they could act without consequence. He wasn't sure yet what he would do, but he knew this. He would not scan a keycard to access his own property, and he sure as hell wasn't going to ask permission to go home. By the next morning, the calm had fractured. Leo opened his front door to find a bright orange cone placed directly at the end of his driveway, flanked by a laminated sign zip-tied to a newly installed temporary pole that read, "Construction Zone. Do not remove." The previous day's machinery was gone, but the damage had been done. Part of his curb had been cut, and the hole now braced a steel box marked Access Control Node, Panel 1. It was still covered in plastic wrap, but the intent was clear. The gate was coming, whether he consented or not. Leo took the sign off and threw the cone to the side, not out of rage but as a simple declaration of fact. He wasn't playing along. Then he turned back inside and spent the next 2 hours on the phone. He contacted the city planning office, the municipal road department, and eventually a clerk at the county recorder's office. Most of what he heard was familiar. Phrases like, "You'll have to speak with your local community board," or, "That street falls under a hybrid classification, private maintenance, public access." It was legal fog, a bureaucratic maze designed to slow people like him down while giving others just enough room to operate in the gray. What unsettled him more than anything was that the deeper he dug, the more it became apparent that the people behind this move hadn't just stumbled into a mistake. They had planned it, and they were counting on his inaction. The name that kept appearing in the documentation, in sign-offs and digital memos, was Karen Milton. Karen lived 2 houses down in a cream-colored home with a custom lawn sign and solar-powered landscape lights that glowed like surveillance sentinels at dusk. She was the type who wore exercise gear with no intention of breaking a sweat, the type who turned neighborhood disputes into opportunities to showcase her ability to command a crowd. Over the years, Leo had watched her ascend from casual busybody to informal power broker. She wasn't officially a public official, but in this pocket of suburbia, she wielded more control than most elected officials. She chaired meetings, scheduled emergency votes, and treated suggestions like orders that had simply not yet been understood. Leo decided to confront her directly, not to start a fight, but to give her a chance to walk away before things escalated. He waited until early evening, when the neighborhood began to quiet down, and walked down the sidewalk past precisely trimmed hedges and identically spaced mailboxes until he reached her home. The front porch light flickered on before he knocked, likely triggered by a motion sensor, but it felt too timely not to be intentional. Karen answered the door with a practiced smile, her body framed by the soft light of what appeared to be a chandelier. "Well, hello there, Leo," she said sweetly, her voice laced with artificial warmth. "Everything okay? I hope the construction crew wasn't too noisy. They're trying to be efficient." "They're trespassing," Leo replied, his voice level. "And they're cutting into a road my family paid to pave. I've looked into the records, and there was no legal notification, no formal vote involving affected properties, and absolutely no consent from me." Karen kept smiling, but her eyes sharpened, calculating. "Oh, Leo, we tried to notify everyone. The vote was held at the March meeting. Flyers went out. Maybe yours got lost in the mail." She gave a little shrug as if that solved everything. "Anyway, the improvements are for everyone's benefit. Safety, security, aesthetic value. It's all part of the long-term plan for neighborhood development." "You don't have jurisdiction over my driveway," Leo said. "You don't have legal easement. And putting a gate across it without a recorded access agreement is unlawful." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her tone cooled. "Leo, I get that this is upsetting for you. But this isn't about you. This is about the community. Your property happens to be in a location that connects 2 main nodes. The board reviewed everything. There was a legal quorum, and we acted accordingly. If you have concerns, there's a process." "What process is that?" Leo asked. "Arguing with people who don't even include me in the vote while they rip up my street." "Don't be dramatic," she said, the mask slipping slightly. "You're welcome to file a formal objection, though I'll warn you, removal of public infrastructure carries a penalty." He stared at her, and she met his gaze with the unblinking calm of someone who believed they were holding all the cards. Then she tilted her head slightly, like she was speaking to a pet that had misbehaved. "You know, Leo, these kinds of decisions don't always go your way. Sometimes the best thing to do is adjust. Be flexible. It'll save you stress." Leo didn't respond. He turned and walked away without a word. Behind him, the door closed gently, almost theatrically like punctuation. That night, he began digging. Not literally, not yet, but in documentation. He downloaded PDFs of city zoning ordinances, reviewed past meeting minutes archived online, and found a discrepancy buried in the footnotes of a 5-month-old amendment draft. The amendment, signed and time-stamped by the council, designated his street as a shared access point due to its strategic location. But it didn't cite any vote by the residents of his section, nor did it include parcel notifications for those technically affected. It was legal sleight of hand. Clever, disgustingly so, the kind of bureaucratic theft that relied on apathy and compliance. But Leo wasn't apathetic, and he didn't comply. The next morning, he took a calculated step. He hired legal counsel, not some random online firm, but a small, aggressive local attorney named Shalene Torres, who had a reputation for 2 things: unshakable knowledge of land use law and zero tolerance for procedural overreach. Leo met her at her office with a manila folder of documents and a calm, meticulous retelling of the past 3 days. Shalene flipped through the pages as she listened, occasionally asking precise follow-up questions. When Leo finished, she leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other, and said, "They made 2 mistakes. First, they touched your property without consent. Second, they put it in writing. By the end of the hour, they had filed an injunction request to halt construction under municipal dispute provisions and drafted a formal cease and desist addressed to the contractors, the council president, and the infrastructure committee. Shalene didn't guarantee victory, but she guaranteed delay. Delay meant leverage, and leverage meant time to prepare a more permanent solution." By the afternoon, Leo returned home to find a letter tucked in his door. This one wasn't laminated. It was handwritten. The ink pressed so hard it bled slightly through the envelope. Inside it read, "If you continue this, you'll lose more than just access. Play along or play alone." No signature, just that. And suddenly, everything shifted. It wasn't just about control anymore. Someone was trying to intimidate him. Leo didn't show the note to anyone. Not yet. But he placed it into a plastic evidence sleeve, set it aside, and quietly installed a motion-activated trail cam in the pine tree overlooking the front drive. Not to catch anyone, just to log movement. Facts were better than panic. Always had been. That evening, he sat on the porch with a mug of black coffee and watched as the shadows stretched long across the asphalt, reaching for the trench where concrete now hardened around steel. The first gate post was in. The wiring had been run. Someone, somewhere, believed this was already finished. But Leo didn't believe in finished. He believed in correction. And the correction was coming. The morning after the handwritten threat, Leo Harrison awoke not to the noise of construction or the hum of engines, but to silence. Too much silence. It was the kind that wrapped around the house like insulation, like the world had been temporarily muffled just for him. The first thing he did was check the trail camera's feed. The device had picked up motion just after midnight. A single figure, tall and broad, walked up the edge of the driveway, paused beneath a tree, and stood motionless for nearly 30 seconds. Then it turned and walked away. No tools, no trespassing beyond the asphalt, but the posture, the stillness. It wasn't casual. It was meant to be noticed. This wasn't about legal process anymore. Someone was watching the response, waiting to see if he'd flinch. He didn't. He downloaded the footage, saved a copy to 2 separate drives, and then texted the timestamp and file to Shalene. No commentary, just the facts. Within the hour, she replied, "Escalation noted. File added. Expect them to probe now. Do not retaliate." Yet, she didn't use emoticons, didn't soften anything with false calm. That's why Leo trusted her. Outside, the trench in the road had been hastily covered with steel plates bolted into the curb, a clear sign that someone expected the site to be temporarily paused, but not abandoned. Across the street, 2 new security signs had been planted into the grass overnight, with company names Leo didn't recognize. He called the numbers. One was disconnected. The other routed him to a voicemail with a generic message and no option for a human representative. It was camouflage, just enough to make a casual observer think it was all official. But Leo had stopped being casual the moment someone touched the boundary of his home. Later that day, a white sedan pulled into the cul-de-sac and parked diagonally near the trench, blocking half of Leo's driveway. A woman stepped out. She wasn't part of any construction crew. Her shoes were polished, heels measured, and her suit looked tailored to someone who had boardrooms scheduled between yoga and wine tastings. She introduced herself as Dana Free, a consultant representing the Community Infrastructure Liaison Task Force. No card, no ID. Just a bright, artificial smile and the kind of condescending calm that professionals use when they think they're the only adult in the room. She asked if Leo had a moment to revisit the conversation about the neighborhood gate project. Leo stepped outside without inviting her in, standing on the gravel just inside his boundary. He listened, arms folded, saying nothing as Dana explained that some residents had expressed concerns about obstructive behavior, and that if he continued to interfere, the council might be forced to classify the area as a conditional improvement zone, which would grant them temporary authority to complete work under public interest protection codes. She said it all like a kindergarten teacher offering a timeout rather than a threat. He asked one question. "Did you write the note?" Dana blinked, her smile flattening into neutrality for a split second. "Excuse me?" "You didn't sign it," Leo continued, "but it was placed on my door after legal filings were sent. I'm assuming you or someone you represent thought it would speed things up." She didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted her cuffs and said, "There's a process for dealing with dissent, Mr. Harrison. That process is being followed." Leo nodded slowly. "Mine too." She left after 3 more minutes of fruitless persuasion, her heels tapping over the steel plates like punctuation marks. Before she drove off, she turned her head slightly, eyes resting on the house behind him, not him directly. She looked at it like it was already being remodeled. That was the kind of arrogance Leo found most dangerous, the assumption that permanence belonged to whoever could file the most paperwork. Over the next 3 days, Leo documented everything, not with paranoia, but with method. Every vehicle that entered the cul-de-sac, every new mark on the sidewalk, every change in signage, every interaction. He logged it. Shailene's advice was clear. If they expected him to act out, to push back emotionally, they'd have the advantage. So he didn't. He became surgical. Then, on the 4th day, the power flickered. Not enough to reset the clocks, not enough to lose internet, just a momentary lapse. But Leo checked his backup systems and found that the voltage drop had occurred specifically on the circuit that ran his workshop's front locks and gate opener. A coincidence was possible, but too unlikely. When he examined the exterior junction box, he found signs that it had been accessed. Not forced open, just opened. A tiny scrape on the lock latch, faint fingerprint smudges on the matte finish. Someone had tested his defenses. That night, Leo stayed up past 2 a.m., not out of fear, but calculation. He wanted to know how far they would go. What kind of people operated like this under the banner of the community development? He left his workshop lights on and waited. Nothing happened, no visitors. But just before dawn, another laminated flyer appeared on his gate. This one was polished, printed in full color with branding. It invited all residents, including adjacent property owners, to a public engagement walkthrough of the new gate installation, scheduled for Saturday morning. The flyer featured a smiling stock photo family standing in front of a gated community entrance. The caption beneath read, "Security starts with unity." Leo didn't tear it down. He photographed it, uploaded it, and forwarded it to Shalene. Saturday came, and with it a trickle of residents. Not a crowd, just enough to generate the illusion of consensus. Karen was there, of course, leading the walkthrough in a salmon-colored blouse and holding a clipboard she didn't look at once. Dana reappeared too, walking with her as though they had always lived there. Leo stayed inside, watching from the window. He noticed something odd. One of the infrastructure team members had parked near the transformer box on the far side of the cul-de-sac, which wasn't part of the installation area. He watched them walk out of sight behind a hedge, clipboard in hand, and not return for almost 20 minutes. Later, when Leo walked the same path, he found nothing obvious. But he did notice that one of his underground cable housings had a fresh scrape on the locking bolt. This was no longer development. It was siege by paperwork and proxy. They were mapping him, not just spatially but structurally, where his vulnerabilities were, where the rules could be bent without snapping. He knew what was coming next. Formal complaints, weaponized code enforcement, possibly utilities involvement. The only reason they hadn't struck harder yet was because they were still unsure if he had leverage beyond what was visible. So he gave them a reason to believe he did. The next day, Leo submitted a request for independent arbitration to the Municipal Conflict Resolution Board. Attached were notarized documents proving independent ownership of the access road segment, easement data, footage of the trench installation, the anonymous note, and correspondence logs. He marked the filing pending escalation, a category that triggered a mandatory city audit within 2 weeks. That slowed everything. Contractors were paused. Materials marked for installation were reallocated. And, most notably, Dana disappeared. No more visits, no more offers of dialogue. But Karen didn't pause. She began a whisper campaign. Nothing overt, nothing actionable. Just enough to stain Leo's standing. Complaints about strange noises from his workshop. Speculation that he was modifying electrical systems without permits. Flyers suddenly missing from his mailbox while others in the cul-de-sac received theirs in triplicate. A pair of landscapers refused to mow near his property line, citing new rules from the committee. That week, someone keyed the side of his truck. The line wasn't deep, just enough to catch the sunlight to leave a mark not worth insurance but impossible to ignore. Leo didn't react. He just buffed it out and installed a second camera, one angled low and wide, facing the opposite side of the drive. Then, with his lawyer's blessing, he filed a formal harassment report. Not against Karen, yet, but against unidentified persons acting in concert with unauthorized development interests. The wording mattered. It shifted the context from neighborly dispute to pattern of intimidation. And for the first time since the conflict began, the response wasn't silence. A letter arrived from the Regional Office of Zoning Compliance. It was short, a single paragraph informing him that a temporary moratorium on infrastructure development had been issued pending review. It didn't name names. It didn't acknowledge wrongdoing, but it gave him space, breathing room, and sometimes that's all a person needs to prepare. The gate wasn't finished. The wiring had stalled. The trench, though plated, was still open underneath. But Leo wasn't celebrating. He wasn't naive enough to think this was victory. It was just part of the game, a pause between moves. And the next one would be his. It was just past noon on a Tuesday when Leo received the call that shifted the tone of everything. The voice on the other end was calm, clipped, and unexpectedly professional. Not from zoning, not from utilities, not from Shalene's office. It belonged to a man who introduced himself as Thomas Bear, a city auditor temporarily assigned to the Municipal Development Oversight Committee. He said his team had received a request for clarification on an infrastructure expansion project that included a gate installation at Leo's address, and there were irregularities in the application trail that warranted an in-person site verification. The tone was not accusatory, but it wasn't casual either. Leo agreed to meet him the next morning. When Bear arrived, he wasn't alone. 2 assistants accompanied him, both carrying tablets and portable scanners. None of them wore suits, just dark slacks, windbreakers, and the kind of shoes people wear when they expect to stand on concrete for hours. They weren't rude, and they didn't ask leading questions. They simply wanted to walk the length of the cul-de-sac, inspect the electrical work, check the trench depth, confirm wiring access points, and verify the chain of custody for any documentation posted on site. Leo kept his answers brief, factual. He didn't embellish. He didn't theorize. He showed the records, the photos, the legal property line markings etched into the old pavement by his father nearly 3 decades ago. When Bear crouched over one of the markings and traced his finger along the faded letters, he didn't say anything for almost 10 seconds. It was then that Leo noticed something important. Bear wasn't just verifying. He was cataloging. He knew, or strongly suspected, that someone had pushed this project through with deliberately incomplete or misrepresented paperwork, and he wasn't there to cover for them. He was there to pin it to the wall before it reached the city's legal department. When they finished the walkthrough, Bear nodded once and said, "You're not the first complaint I've seen, but this is the first one where the landowner kept records better than the committee did." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "You might want to hold off on any structural responses. Something tells me the people behind this won't be running the show much longer." That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. That evening, Leo stood at his kitchen sink rinsing his hands and watching the light fade over the trees when he saw a group of teens walk past the trench. That wasn't unusual. Students often cut through the cul-de-sac on their way home. But these ones weren't local. He didn't recognize the faces. One of them paused, looked directly at the house, and pointed. The others laughed and the group moved on. 10 minutes later, Leo stepped outside and found a bag of garbage dumped at the end of his driveway. The contents weren't random. It wasn't just refuse. Someone had taken the time to fill the bag with broken electronics, stripped cords, smashed batteries, and melted circuit boards. Junk, sure, but symbolically pointed. A mockery of what he did for a living. It didn't scare him. It didn't even enrage him. It confirmed that whoever was behind this no longer felt constrained by procedure. The gate wasn't the end game. It was the wedge, the way in. They wanted him boxed in, pressured, isolated until it became easier to push him out than to keep resisting. That night, Leo had a long conversation with Shalene. She had already received a preliminary brief from the city auditor's office indicating a suspension of several infrastructure contracts in the region pending ethics review. But that process would take months. Meanwhile, nothing would prevent new community proposals from being floated, ways to reclaim spaces, streamline traffic, or modernize residential alignment. Shalene advised patience. But Leo wasn't interested in patience anymore. He wanted resolution. Not just legally, but physically. He wanted the end of this project to be visible, tangible, something that couldn't be reversed by a stroke of a pen or the next local election. The next day, he put in a private order. Not for a fence, not for signs. For a custom-fabricated gate designed by a partner he trusted, someone who specialized in hardened industrial access systems typically used at data centers and medical facilities. It wouldn't look aggressive. It wouldn't even look expensive. But it would be exact. Code access, multi-layer security, automatic relock protocol, manual override with biometric fallback. The delivery window was tight. The installation team would arrive over the weekend, at night, under commercial contract. Not as a homeowner improvement, but as a corporate security deployment. He didn't inform the neighborhood. He didn't seek approval. He wasn't building a monument. He was replacing the thing they had tried to force on him with something better, smarter, and entirely his. The gate was installed in under 6 hours. It was silent, seamless, and utterly unassuming from the street. To anyone driving by, it looked like a minimalistic entry system, a post and an arch with a brushed aluminum faceplate. But it was smart. It logged every approach. It could differentiate between motion and intent. And it was invisible to any of the central access panels tied to the failed council plan. It didn't use their infrastructure. It didn't require their permission. On Monday morning, Karen showed up. Leo heard her before he saw her. The unmistakable cadence of practiced outrage filtered through a too-loud voice. She marched up to the gate and slapped her hand against the glass panel. It lit up, scanned, and returned a message. Access denied. No profile found. She pressed it again, harder this time, and called out, "Leo, this is community property. You can't block access. You're violating collective mobility statutes." He opened the window and leaned out calmly. "You're trespassing. This isn't your access point. It never was." She tried to argue, but her voice was swallowed by the gate's silence. No one came to her defense. No one followed. The installation had caught them off guard. It wasn't a protest. It was a solution, and solutions were harder to fight. The next day, a new complaint was filed with the city under Karen's name, citing obstruction of shared resources. It was dismissed within 48 hours. Bear's report had gone live. The project was frozen. The funding flagged. And while no one was fired, the development committee announced an internal realignment of oversight personnel. Leo didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or post online. He just walked out to the gate one evening as the sun dipped behind the trees, entered his code, and watched it open. Quiet, clean, responsive. It was a gate, yes, but not their gate. Not the one meant to control him. It was his. And for the first time in weeks, the silence around his house didn't feel threatening. It felt earned. The silence didn't last. For a brief moment, it felt like equilibrium had returned. Leo's gate stood functional. The city inquiry had stalled further infrastructure development, and the usual rhythm of the neighborhood resumed. But control, once challenged, rarely retreats quietly. Karen might have lost the public momentum, but people like her never relied solely on meetings and memos. She shifted tactics. Instead of lobbying committees, she started targeting systems, the informal networks that governed daily life, the places rules couldn't easily reach. And this time, she didn't come to Leo's door. She went around him. It began with delivery issues. Packages that had always arrived like clockwork were suddenly marked as undeliverable. Leo didn't think much of it until a technician from his security supply vendor called to confirm a rejected shipment. According to their notes, access had been denied by a local residential safety monitor, a title that didn't officially exist. When Leo pressed the courier company, they said a woman with ID matching community operations credentials had blocked the truck from entering the cul-de-sac, citing a pending hazard review. There was no record of any such review, and there was no authority that gave her that power. But the delay cost Leo 3 days on a part for a client job, an expensive delay. The next sign was the garbage. His bins, left at the usual curb spot, were untouched while every other house's waste was collected like clockwork. On the 3rd consecutive week of being skipped, Leo called the city waste division, who politely explained that a new routing system had flagged his address as part of an unserviced pocket. He asked why only his house was flagged. The answer was vague. Recent jurisdictional mapping updates. They promised to look into it. They didn't. So Leo started hauling his own trash to the nearest station. He didn't argue. He didn't make a scene. He documented it. Every missed pickup, every call, every receipt for self-hauling. Then came the inspection. An SUV with a faded city seal pulled up one Thursday morning, and a man in khakis and a windbreaker stepped out with a clipboard and a digital pad. He introduced himself as building compliance from the Auxiliary Residential Review Team. Leo asked him plainly what prompted the visit. The man was cordial but evasive. A community member had submitted concerns about unlicensed structural modifications, particularly concerning electrical hardware installed without disclosure. It was Karen. She hadn't attacked the gate directly. She'd gone after the wiring, the system that ran it. Leo didn't argue. He let the inspector walk the perimeter. He presented the invoice, the certification from the installer, the city permit code that allowed for private automation as long as it didn't interfere with traffic. The inspector, to his credit, seemed more annoyed than suspicious. He muttered about neighborhood micromanagers and thanked Leo for his cooperation. But even after the inspector left, Leo knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't just trying to undo what he'd built. She was attempting to drown him in administrative friction. The following week, a contractor knocked on Leo's door, claiming to be there for survey confirmation regarding the proposed widening of the pedestrian sidewalk running alongside the cul-de-sac. Leo asked to see the order. The man fumbled, eventually produced a digital form with Leo's name on it, misspelled slightly, and coordinates placing his property directly in the new path. According to the form, Leo had agreed to relinquish 1.2 meters of edge frontage for community enhancement. He hadn't. The signature wasn't his. He asked who submitted the plan. The contractor shrugged. "We just go where we're told." Leo called Shalene. This time the conversation was short. She asked for a copy of the form, the contractor's info, and any communication he could gather. Then she said flatly, "This is coordinated. It's not about a gate anymore. It's about neutralizing you." Leo started to feel it. The weight, not the stress, but the spread. The sense that someone had their fingers in systems he couldn't see, couldn't reach. That's what people like Karen did. They didn't need to win in a courtroom. They won in the shadows by weaponizing the little things, the things you rely on working properly just to live your life. They didn't knock down walls. They made your pipes leak, your mail stop arriving, your name disappear from databases where it should have never been touched. So Leo adjusted. He installed a second-layer control panel on the inside of the gate, unmarked, hidden behind a panel cover. It ran on a parallel system, disconnected from the outer keypad. He rerouted a portion of the security feed to a local encrypted server, one with no external sync. He didn't post about it. He didn't share it. He simply prepared for the next inevitable breach, because it was coming. And it came at 3:12 a.m. The motion sensor on the south fence tripped. Not an animal. Too direct, too steady. Leo was already dressed when the third alert sounded. He didn't turn on the house lights. He stepped quietly into his side yard, using only ambient glow from the porch camera feed relayed to his phone. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. He wasn't going to confront. He was going to observe. At the edge of the property, behind the hedge, a man crouched next to the fiber box. He wore dark clothing, gloves, a baseball cap. He moved with precision. Not a junkie, not a teen. Professional. He clipped a line, inserted a device no larger than a deck of cards, then moved toward the eastern utility post. Leo watched him mark something on the box. Paint. Just a dot. Coded. Then he disappeared. By sunrise, Leo had already extracted the feed and isolated the footage. The man hadn't entered the property, but he had tagged it. Leo sent the video to Shalene with a one-line message. "We need to escalate." Within 48 hours, a private counter-surveillance firm arrived under non-disclosure. Their sweep confirmed that Leo's network had been passively scanned over the previous 4 nights. Someone was probing wireless vulnerabilities, mapping, recording, tracing behavior. It wasn't criminal by traditional standards, but it was predatory. Surveillance with intent. And that meant only one thing. Someone, somewhere, was preparing a case. Not a legal one, but a campaign, a pressure strategy. The city might not approve their gate. The council might not have jurisdiction. But public opinion? That could be manipulated. If Leo's name became associated with paranoia, aggression, non-compliance, they could isolate him. Socially, commercially. They could starve him without touching his property. So Leo made a choice. He filed a disclosure, not to the press, but to the city's Internal Ethics Commission. Not a complaint, a report, anonymized where needed, but direct. He laid out the sequence: unapproved construction, false delivery blocks, manipulated city services, forged survey signatures, physical tagging, and passive digital intrusion. He didn't name Karen. He didn't need to. He let the pattern speak. He submitted it not to provoke, but to freeze movement. And it worked. City contractors stopped entering the cul-de-sac. Sidewalk expansion projects were suspended. The trash pickups resumed. His mail began arriving normally again. The inspector who had visited him weeks earlier called to clarify some additional site notes and casually mentioned that his supervisor had been contacted by an administrative inquiry team. And Karen? She disappeared. Not literally, but she was no longer leading community meetings. Her name no longer appeared on updates. A new acting liaison was listed. A nervous-looking man who stammered through emailed announcements and asked for community patience during transition. But Leo didn't relax. He began Phase 2 of his gate project, an expansion, not in size, but in reach. He linked access control to a digital approval matrix, one that required multi-point validation. Every visitor was now logged, verified, and matched against his independent database. If someone claimed to be from the city, they had to check out. If someone said they were authorized by the neighborhood, they'd be denied, not because Leo was paranoid, but because he had learned that the real danger didn't come from people breaking in. It came from those who believed they had the right to walk through, uninvited, unquestioned. And so he built something that finally did what the original gate was always meant to do. Not keep people out, but force them to reveal who they were when they tried to come in. It started not with a knock at the door or a letter in the mailbox, but with an alert on Leo's phone. A quiet, pulsing notification from the secondary panel he'd installed behind the main gate faceplate. Unauthorized attempt. Biometric spoof. Entry denied. Location, Southern Access. Time, 2:47 a.m. He sat up instantly, adrenaline catching in his throat. Another attempt, but this time more aggressive. Not a scan, a bypass. He moved quickly but deliberately, pulling on boots, grabbing the hardened tablet from the charging dock and activating the live perimeter view. The footage showed 3 figures near the south line. Not at the main gate, but at the older maintenance access where city crews used to enter for utility work. The latch had been reinforced, sensors installed, the panel sealed. But they weren't there for diagnostics. One of them held a thermal probe. Another had a keycard duplicator strapped to their wrist. These weren't local thugs or kids. They were equipped. Leo didn't go outside. He didn't call the police either. Not immediately. Instead, he activated the gate's emergency lockdown protocol. It was silent. No alarms, no flashing lights. But it sent a cascading command across every entry point. Freeze access, isolate networks, trigger passive recording, alert legal counsel. 5 minutes later, Shalene received the footage. Within 10, a private patrol car from the firm she had on standby pulled into the cul-de-sac. The three men vanished before it arrived. What followed wasn't chaos. It was scrutiny. By mid-morning, the City Ethics Commission contacted Leo directly. The footage had been forwarded to them through encrypted channels, flagged under ongoing administrative review. They thanked him for his cooperation and continued documentation, and informed him that an internal audit was expanding to include private contractor activity, particularly concerning unauthorized surveillance or physical encroachment on residential infrastructure. Leo didn't need to be told what that meant. Karen's plan, whatever it had evolved into, was now radioactive. The city had been embarrassed, manipulated into almost enabling a civil violation dressed as a public safety measure. The moment that tape hit internal review, nobody wanted their name associated with the blueprint. But Leo also knew that cornered people didn't always retreat. Sometimes they lashed out. That afternoon, a black SUV with no plates parked half a block down. The driver never got out, just sat there, engine idle. Leo noted the make and model, recorded the timestamp, saved the plate cavity's lack of ID. 20 minutes later, it pulled away. No confrontation, no message, just pressure, just presence. Then the formal complaint arrived. Not from the city, not from a board, but from a newly formed Resident Protection Committee, a vague, unofficial-sounding body that accused Leo of installing surveillance equipment that violated community expectations of privacy and threatened harmonious integration. The letter was unsigned but watermarked. And the watermark? It matched the branding Karen had used for the original gate proposal months earlier. Leo forwarded the letter to Shalene without comment. Her response was quicker than usual. They're throwing what's left of their weight around, but they're off balance. They're testing to see if you'll overstep. Don't. He didn't. Instead, he went to the heart of the problem. The old network box on the eastern side, the one that connected the cul-de-sac's security lighting and partial infrastructure relay. It had been sitting dormant since the council suspended the gate project, but he knew it hadn't been decommissioned. It was still powered, still connected to something. He opened it legally with tools and permits, and inside he found exactly what he expected: a relay tied to an external remote access module, one not part of any city-approved system. It had been added later, sloppy wiring, different screws, a signal transmitter designed to piggyback on low-bandwidth pulses. Someone had been watching the neighborhood even after the council froze the plan. He photographed everything, documented the panel's serial numbers, removed nothing. That night, with Shalene's coordination, the findings were submitted to a citywide oversight body that governed infrastructure ethics and contractor conduct. The response was immediate. A field team dispatched, hardware collected, a quiet investigation launched. Not against Leo, but against the people who'd tried to hide behind him. And then it broke. Not publicly, not in a scandal, but in the quiet vacuum that forms when power evaporates. Karen withdrew from the resident board permanently. No announcement, no explanation. Her house went up for sale 2 weeks later, listed under a shell brokerage. No one said her name aloud at meetings anymore. The sidewalk project was officially scrapped. The trench, long since plated over, was filled, repaved, erased. The steel stumps intended for gate arms were quietly removed by a new contractor, one who didn't speak much and didn't ask for signatures. Leo's address was restored to independent classification in the zoning maps, a line redrawn with silent apology. But the last real move came 1 week after the repaving. It was evening. Leo stood in his front yard, adjusting a sensor mount when a woman approached. Not Karen. Not Dana. Someone older, thinner, dressed in the kind of generic athletic gear that fit into any suburb. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask questions. She simply said, "You know, this was never really about you. It was about the road, about what connects and what divides. You just happened to be in the middle." Leo looked at her, then back toward the street. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You people think roads are the same as doors. You think because something's in between, it must belong to whoever shouts the loudest." The woman gave a small smile, half sincere, half wounded. "You're not wrong. But just remember, the next person who pushes might not stop when you push back. They might push through." Leo nodded slowly. "Then they'll learn the hard way." She left without another word. No name, no vehicle, no file. Just a walk into the dusk. That night, Leo updated the gate firmware one last time. He added a line to the authentication protocol. Not a warning, not a message, just a flag. Any access attempt from unknown systems will trigger full lockdown and audit. He saved it, closed the panel, and sat quietly on the porch as the wind shifted. The gate remained still. The lights stayed dim. The perimeter held. He had built something stronger than steel or software. He had built precedent, not just for himself, but for every person who ever got a notice saying, "This has already been decided." And this time, it hadn't been. Weeks passed, and the neighborhood didn't so much return to normal as it settled into a new rhythm. Quieter, more cautious. People still watered their lawns and waved at passing cars, but the meetings lost their edge, their self-importance. The newsletter stopped arriving every Saturday. The so-called resident committees dissolved quietly, their energy having dissipated the moment it became clear that someone, somewhere, had drawn a line in the dirt and refused to let it be crossed. Leo's gate stood as it had been designed, unchanged, unbent, uninviting to interference. It did not hum with hostility, nor did it project arrogance. It simply existed, perfectly functional, utterly indifferent to the opinions of those who once believed they could manipulate its existence into submission. Karen's house sold, as expected. The sign stayed up for barely 3 days before it was removed in the middle of the night. The new owners, a young couple with no known ties to any prior residents, moved in with quiet efficiency. No welcome parties were organized. No introductions forced. Leo nodded to them once as they unloaded furniture, and that was enough. They didn't ask about the gate. They didn't question the layout of the road or suggest changes to the cul-de-sac's boundaries. They simply adapted. One morning, Leo noticed that the neighborhood children, who had once detoured around his home on their way to school, had started walking past his property again. Not boldly, not suspiciously, just naturally, as though the social current had begun to reroute itself without formal instruction. He adjusted one of the exterior sensors to create a shadowless path for them, ensuring that the gate's motion detection wouldn't flag harmless activity. It wasn't a concession. It was a calibration. Precision over paranoia. Shalene called a week later, not to report progress or discuss a legal formality, but simply to check in. Her voice, usually crisp and transactional, softened as they spoke. Not out of sentiment, but out of mutual respect born from having weathered something deliberate and structural together. She informed him that the last remaining item tied to his property had been removed from the city's discretionary project docket. There would be no further review periods, no unannounced surveys, no sidewalk proposals slipped between committee lines. The paperwork was closed. It was over. Leo didn't react with relief. He didn't celebrate. He just said, "Thank you," and meant it. He hung up the phone, stepped outside, and walked the length of the drive to the gate. It stood there exactly as it had the day it was installed, framed against the morning sky with a kind of quiet dignity that didn't ask to be noticed. He placed his hand against the access panel and watched as the screen lit up, asked for authentication, and accepted his presence without ceremony. Beyond the gate, the street stretched in both directions. Empty, peaceful, mundane. The world hadn't changed, not really. Bureaucracy would continue. So would ambition. But here, on this narrow piece of land that so many had tried to annex with language and process and pressure, nothing moved unless Leo allowed it. And that was enough. Later that evening, as the sun lowered and the trees cast long golden shadows across the asphalt, Leo sat on the porch with a mug of coffee and the sound of cicadas growing louder by the minute. The air was still, but not heavy, the kind of stillness that wasn't absence, but balance. He wasn't waiting for the next attack nor planning his next move. He wasn't holding on to tension like a coiled wire. He had already made his decision, and the world had responded accordingly. The gate clicked softly behind him as its nightly cycle reset, the lights dimming to standby mode, the panel entering sleep. It didn't need to do more. It didn't need to send messages or make statements. It simply worked. And so did Leo. He had rebuilt not just a boundary, but a standard. One that couldn't be overridden by convenience or charisma. And in a neighborhood once ruled by paperwork dressed as authority, that was the one thing none of them had planned for. A man who did not yield to the illusion of consensus, who did not seek permission to stand on his own ground. Not a war hero, not a victim, just someone who understood that control was never about rules. It was about who enforced them. And Leo had made it clear, here, enforcement belonged to him.